Hello and welcome to Canvas+Paint. My name is Katie Guthrie and you are watching an online program provided by Garden City Arts. Today I'm going to lead you step by step through the painting process on how to recreate this painting. Now, the structure of the class is so that I will demonstrate the step on my demo painting. Then at the end, I will put up on the screen the finished product on the left-hand side and the step that we're on that you need to have completed on the right-hand side. This gives you the opportunity to pause the video if you need to and go back and kind of re-watch anything. Now, before we get started, let's go ahead and talk about supplies. If you purchased a kit from Garden City Arts, then all of your colors are pre-mixed and laid out, pre-mixed and put in containers, and they're labeled 1 through 7. You'll want to lay them out on your foam plate, your palette, like so. If you did not buy a kit, no stress. You can use the colors that are listed on the video to mix your own. You will also need a cup for water, brushes, a piece of chalk, paper towel, and of course your canvas. I pre-painted this a light tan or beige color for you if you bought the kit. Now, brushes, really fast, you'll definitely want to have a large wash brush, a medium-sized wash brush, a shader brush, and a round brush. Okay, so if you have all of those things, we can go ahead and get started. So we are on step number 1, and step number 1 involves color 1. This is a kind of butter-ish color, a light yellow. You are going to grab your 1-inch wash brush, or your biggest one, whatever you have handy, doesn't have to be 1 inch, and you're going to prime your brush. Anytime you use a brush for the first time and you are trying to blend, which is what we're going to be doing on this first few steps, you want to make sure that your brush is damp. So I dip it into the paint water, pat it dry in my paper towel, and make sure that it's nice and cool to the touch, but not dripping wet. Now, remember, there's a few things that you'll want to remember, and I'm going to cover this really fast before we move forward with all the other steps. Paint covers paint. Don't stress, okay? This should not be a stressful process. If you really absolutely hate it, we can cover it up. And with this background, which we're going to start with, if there's parts that you don't really like about the background, maybe it doesn't transition well into another color, no stress. Put a cloud on it. Don't worry, okay? If all else fails, let your paint dry and go back to the step that you were on where everything kind of went wrong and re-watch and redo. No worries. The other thing I want to point out is that you can actually erase paint if you get it fast enough. So let's say I made a mark that I wasn't very happy with. What I have to do to get rid of that mark is take a clean, damp brush, and while the paint is still wet, I wiggle my brush back and forth, and look at that, it picks the paint right up. Now, you have to continuously clean out your brush because your brush will get heavy with the paint and then it'll stop erasing. And then once you have everything that you didn't like erased, you're good to go. You might let that area dry a little bit before you attack it again or retry, and then you can move on, okay? So remember, paint covers paint, or if all else fails and the paint's still wet, you can erase. Alrighty, so now that I've covered those 3 things about brush wetness or priming your brush, and about mistakes and how you can erase them, let's move on to this very first step. I'm going to take quite a bit of this butter yellow, and I'm going to start kind of around the horizon line, and I'm going to establish where my light source is. This is going to be the brightest part of our sky, and so that is where the sun is kind of setting behind the horizon. The horizon line, of course, is where the ground meets the sky. We're not going to put that horizon line in until, oh gosh, I think step number 6, but just keep that in mind. You don't have to bring your yellow all the way down because we will be covering it up with the ground. I'm going to start right where I imagine my horizon line to be, and I'm going to use the broad side of my brush going back and forth to make a big line. If I turn my brush to the thinnest part, do you see how it makes a very thin line? Well, right now we don't need thin lines. Right now we need to cover space. So if we were dividing our sky into fourths, this is about 25% of our sky. Now, if your paint is dry and scratchy, that's okay. Take a little bit of water by dipping your paintbrush in the water and mix it into your paint. That will make your paint a little less dry and a little bit more fluid and easier to work with. So I'm covering up about 25% of my sky, and then I'm ready to swirl, tap, and dry my brush and move on. Keep in mind, you do want your paint to be fairly thick. At some points of this painting, you can let your underpainting or the tan show through. This is not one of them. This part you want to be nice and bright. As the paint dries, if you notice that it needs a little touch up, no worries, you still have extra paint. So I am swirling my brush in the paint water, tapping on the rim of the can to get out extra water, and then patting it dry on my paper towel. Swirl, tap, and dry will make your brush nice and clean, and then you'll be ready to move on. All right, we're ready for step number 2. That involves color 2 in your kit. You can go ahead and grab the light orange. You're going to continue using your biggest wash brush, and this step is all about basically filling in the other half of your bottom portion of your sky. So we're going to attack this in 2 steps, okay? First, we're going to fill the left bottom portion of your sky in. This step, you don't have to worry about the paint being extra thick or covering up everything. You can let some of the tan pop through, no stress. So that's the first half, is that I am just filling this in. The second half is to do a little bit of blending. Now, when you are blending, you want to make sure that the paint of the previous color that you added, so in our case, the light yellow, is wet, and you want to make sure that the paint that you're adding is also very wet. It's called wet on wet painting. Okay, your surface is wet and your paint is wet, and so that helps things blend. Now, colors will not blend unless you let them speak to each other, unless you mix them and move them around on the canvas together. So what I mean by that is that I have to bring this orange into the yellow just a little bit. Otherwise, they won't. If you stop, you'll have a hard line like you see right here, demonstrated kind of towards the middle of the canvas. Now, yellow is kind of a wuss. He gets taken over very easy by other colors, kind of gets bullied by them. So if you notice that your orange is taking over and you're losing a lot of your yellow, no worries. Take your brush, swirl, tap, and dry it, clean it off, and then introduce your yellow back in, and maybe move the yellow a little bit into the orange, and you will have a nice blend. So do you see how I'm doing big brushes back and forth? Big brush strokes back and forth. Sorry about that. Big brush strokes back and forth. That really will help aid your blending. Now, I have a pretty good transition from yellow to kind of light yellowish, orangish color to straight orange. I'm going to just go ahead and do a very quick layer of additional orange on the left-hand side and then move it into my right-hand side and be done. Once you're happy with your blend, you can move on to step number 3. Okay, we're on step number 3. That involves color number 3. And we're going to go ahead and fill in a little bit more of the sky. We're going to start where we left off with the orange, and we're going to bring this light pink all the way up to the top of our canvas and bring it almost all the way over to cover both the right and the left-hand side. I'm going to leave just a little bit of the canvas empty because I'm going to come in with color number 4 to fill it in on step number 4. So go ahead and grab your brush. We're still using the big wash brush. Grab a little bit of your pink, and remember, you want to work, we're still doing wet on wet blending, so make sure that your surface, the orange, is still a little bit wet. If it's not, you might want to hit it again with the orange paint. And once again, I am going to be transitioning from pink into the orange yellow. Okay, and if you don't have orange right there, that's okay. If you have yellow, that's all right. You can transition from yellow to pink. You can transition from pink to orange, whatever you want. Remember, this is your painting, and it's okay if it doesn't end up looking exactly like mine. My demo painting will not look exactly like my original. No stress. Okay, so I'm using the broad side of my brush to cover up space, and I'm going to bring this pink over all the way across into the left-hand side of the canvas. Once I have a nice base of this light pink on my canvas, I can start worrying about the transition. When I am blending and trying to blend in a small area, I often turn my brush to its thinnest point so that I'm making that line, remember? So broad covers up space, thin or turning your brush to the thinnest point makes a line. That can be really nice when you are trying to transition colors. Okay, so I have a little bit of a transition from my pink to my orange to my yellow right there. And then over here, it's a bit easier. It's just a transition from pink to orange. Okay, once you're happy with this, you can move on. Remember, you can let some of the tan pop through, or you can use really thick, heavy paint with not a lot of water mixed into it to cover up that tan. So you get a really bright pink. Okay. All right, we're ready for color number 4 and step number 4. This is a slightly darker pink. So far we've been working with really some light pastel colors. Now we're going to start putting in some darker colors, and those darker colors are going to stay primarily in the top left-hand portion of our sky. About 25% is going to be, of the sky, is going to be this darker pink. So I'm going to start right in the corner, and I'm using pretty heavy paint with not a lot of water mixed in, because I really do want it to cover and be quite dark. So whenever you mix water into paint, it makes it more transparent and therefore appear a little bit lighter. So if you want it to look darker without actually mixing another color in, the best way to do that is to not mix water into your paint. Okay, so I covered up the corner, and now I need to worry about blending and transitioning from dark to light. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to swirl, tap, and dry. Because my surface is wet and the paint that I just introduced is still wet, everything is wet and movable, I'm going to take a clean, damp brush and I'm going to lightly brush over those edges. What this is doing is it's basically not introducing any more paint onto my canvas, but it's just letting the colors that are already there kind of blend and mesh together. Now, this is if you want to keep the sky fairly light. If you would like darker colors to dominate the sky and less of the light colors, then you're going to reintroduce more of this pink paint, and you're going to bring the pink paint over and expand it or invade it into the other lighter areas of your canvas. Okay, so remember, this is your painting. Everyone has a different aesthetic preference. Some like lighter colors, others like darker colors. Personally, I'm trying to keep my sky fairly light because I want my clouds to be the darkest part of the sky, so that there's really nice contrast. Okay, but everyone's different, and that's okay. So once you're happy with your sky, swirl, tap, and dry your brush, and then we'll move on in just a moment. Okay, we're ready for step number 5, which involve clouds. Now, we're going to start off with a dark color, and then we'll introduce our lighter colors back into our clouds on the next few steps. So this is just one step of 3 for our clouds. I'm sorry, one step of 2 for our clouds. So this is the dark step, just establishing them. Now, before we do the clouds, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about clouds. First, clouds can be anything, but they are very rarely boxy. So think of curvy lines, think of waves and swirls and swipes, so thin, airy strips. Clouds are transparent, so we are going to be adding water to our paint to make the paint a little bit lighter. And then also, the last thing that you want to think about with clouds is that when you get closer to the horizon line, clouds usually get smaller because they're farther away. So by making the clouds that are close to the horizon line tiny and making the clouds that are closer to the top of the painting larger, you will be creating depth in your painting quite easily. So I'm going to demonstrate really fast, and I'm going to put in, well, at least outline where I want all of my clouds to be. Now, I'm going to continue using my big brush, but if you are a beginner painter, this is where you might want to switch to a smaller brush. It might be easier for you to control. Okay, I'm using my brush. If you are switching to that smaller brush, remember you need to prime it, so dip it in paint water, pat it dry, don't use a dry brush. And I'm going to use color number 5. If I'm trying to make a more transparent paint, then I mix water into it to make it very light and see-through. So by mixing a little bit of water in, I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to put in these very small little tiny clouds. They're basically just where I use the top of my brush to make a little line. If you want, you can use the top edge of your brush to add some little swirls to the top to give them a little bit more body, okay? So there are my clouds kind of at the bottom. They're the small ones, right? Then as I move up, I can get thicker paint, that is more paint and less water, and I can start adding some bigger clouds. These are still tiny, really, when you think about it, especially when we put in this really, really big cloud that we'll be getting to in just a moment. So this is like a medium-sized cloud, and medium-sized clouds are in the middle, okay? Small bottom, medium middle, top big. Think that when you're making these clouds and when you're trying to figure out the sizing of your clouds. So I have a few more clouds. When I'm making clouds, and I would suggest highly, or I'd recommend to kind of watch me make these for a little bit before you start this step. I'm going to employ a smaller brush. You want to think about swiping, okay? So swiping back and forth. You want to think about swirling, where you're swirling your brush, and you want to think about tapping. So swipe, swirling, and tapping will create really interesting clouds that have a lot of dimension and depth. You can also make little teeny tiny clouds that are almost just little afterthoughts in the background. Okay, so I've put a few smaller clouds in the middle. Now I'm going to focus on the top of my painting and establish some really big clouds. First, I'm going to put in, and with these bigger clouds, I'm going to use thicker paint. First, I'm going to put in a nice big cloud that's going up and off the top of my canvas. He's so big, he cannot be contained, okay? So I'm putting quite a bit. Now, if your canvas is wet like mine, you'll start to blend into your sky, and that is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't fight it. Don't think you're doing something wrong. That's a good thing. But remember, clouds should be round and wispy. They should have some like really soft edges that kind of just disappear into the background. And think of tumors, okay? If your cloud ends up being a box, I'm just going to make a really boxy cloud really fast, just to demonstrate, okay? That looks a little bit weird, right? That boxy cloud. Here, let me make it a little thicker so we can see it on camera. That looks a little weird. So the way we fix it is that we give it a tumor. We do some swirling, swiping on the edges to bring it out, and give it some knobs and tumors, okay? Just by doing that, you're gonna make your cloud look so much more realistic and natural. Now, this cloud, that was my demo for the boxy cloud, is going to turn into my biggest cloud. He's going to go up and off the canvas and come all the way down and maybe create like another kind of medium-sized cloud where they become entangled and almost become one cloud right in there. Okay. Also keep in mind that your cloud doesn't have to be completely resolved on this step, because we're going to put in some light paint in a little bit. So don't feel like, oh, this doesn't look good, this doesn't look right. That's okay, because it's only part one or step one of these clouds. Okay, I'm pretty happy with my clouds. I don't think I want to add anything else to them otherwise, or add more. Otherwise, I'm going to take up all my sky. Keep in mind when you're choosing the placement for your clouds, you might choose different places, and that's okay, especially if you have areas where you're like, ooh, I just really don't like how I did that. Well, cover it up with a cloud. I have a little area right here where I'm not happy with, so I'm just going to extend that cloud and cover it up. No stress. Okay, go ahead and put in your clouds, and then we will move on to the next step. Okay, back with step number 6 and color number 6. So this color, even though it looks very similar to color number 4, it is actually just has a little bit more red and a little bit less quinacridone. Quinacridone is kind of like a magenta or a purple, so this is a bit more of a pink or a red. We're going to use this color to put some details into our clouds. So this is where the sun is highlighting the clouds. All clouds are different, okay? On a sunny day, clouds will look backlit. On a sunset picture, clouds are going to have highlights and pinks and red hues, because the sun is casting on them. And generally, you'll find the lightest parts of the clouds on the bottom, because it's closest to the setting sun, okay? So when you're putting in your highlights, kind of try to stick to the bottoms of the clouds or the middle of the cloud, and think about how the dark is in the back of the cloud, the dark that we put in, and the front of the cloud, what we're putting in, is going to be the lighter part, which is going to be hit by the sun right now. Okay, so I'm going to take my color number 6, and I'm just going to do some tapping. So this is where the tapping really comes in handy. You're not covering up the whole cloud. You're focusing on the bottom, right? The bottom where the sun is highlighting the cloud or hitting the cloud the most. You can also always come back in with some of your dark if you feel like you didn't, ooh, that was a little too much dark. But if you feel like it wasn't dark enough in an area, you can always come in and just set back a color and throw that dark back in. I would not recommend doing quite as heavy-handed as I did it just now. Okay, so I'm tapping, and then I can swirl and I can swipe in some of this lighter color. Remember, clouds are free, they're loose, you're not really tight and controlled. You're really moving your hand quite a bit and your wrist quite a bit to get these really beautiful lines that feel kind of effortless, like clouds. I'm going to put just a little tiny bit on these bottom clouds, and this is where finger painting comes in really handy. Okay, you can use your finger to just kind of tap it in and dot it in. And then when you're happy with your clouds, you're ready to move on. I'm going to play around with my clouds for just a little bit, kind of fix one of the little issues that I'm having. I'm going to speed up the video, and you can watch, or you can get to painting your own clouds. Once you're happy with your clouds, we're ready to move on to step number 7, which involves black. We are putting in the ground. All right, so with your biggest brush, you are going to take your black paint. You might need to mix just a little bit of water into your black paint if it's dry like mine. And then you're going to use the top edge of your brush to make a line. So we're going to make the horizon line really fast. We're going to cover up any part of the sky that's dry and scratchy that we don't want visible. And I'm going to put a nice kind of curvy line that maybe goes up a little bit higher on the side where you want your focal point. Now in this case, the focal point is, of course, would be the 3 crosses. However, you do not have to do the 3 crosses. You can come up with anything you'd like, okay? Windmills, maybe a tree, anything. Even if you don't want to focal point at all and you just want to focus on this gorgeous skyscape, you can do that, of course, too. You could always bring your sky down more so that your sky or your ground is smaller. There's lots of things that you can do. Keep in mind, this is your painting. You can make it however you'd like. Okay, so once I have that line in, I'm going to go back to using the broad part of my brush, and I'm going to fill in everything below the horizon line. I'm going to speed up the video really fast because obviously you don't need to see me filling an area with solid black paint. Keep in mind, you want to keep your paint fairly thick, not very watered down, and you can always go back over it with a second layer if you need to. Okay? Okay, once you have your ground in, you are ready to put objects on top of your ground. Again, you could do the 3 crosses. You can look up other silhouettes online and put those in instead. These crosses I kept fairly small. You could make them really big if you want to. If you made them really big, they would appear closer to us. Right now, the crosses are maybe farther away from us. We're maybe viewing them from a farther distance, and that's why they're so small. Again, you can make them bigger, especially if there's some areas in your sky that you're not happy about it. Well, that's cool. Just put a cross on it, no stress, or a windmill, or whatever you'd like to put. I'm going to paint what the original painting has in it, and I'm going to show you how to do that right now with a smaller brush. You can also use your shader brush, which is very small, if you need that, especially if you're still learning on how to control your brush. I'm going to use the black paint, and once again, I'm using the top edge of my brush, okay, so not the side, but the top. The side is for filling in, the top is for making lines, and I'm going to start by putting a vertical line, okay, using the top edge of the brush, and then you can put in your horizontal line. Okay, so I'm gonna mix a little bit of water into my paint just to make it nice and fluid. Remember, a little bit of water helps make your paint easier to work with. A lot of water makes it transparent. Okay, I'm going to start with the biggest one in the middle, since that is really the focal point. And I'm going to go ahead, I might make my cross just a little bit bigger in this in this demo painting than I did in the original. And then I will put on the horizontal line, the line going from left to right. So start with the line going up and down, and then put in the line going from left to right. You can also make it look kind of worn, like worn wood. It doesn't have to be perfect and precise. It's really good to use a bigger brush for that. If you're trying to go for more precise, use a smaller brush. Then I'm going to put in the crosses on the sides. And once you have your crosses in, you are ready to do the highlights. Now, my underpainting is still wet. The yellow that's underneath is still wet, and so it's kind of blending together to make my cross kind of a lighter gray. That's okay. I'm actually going to put some highlights on right now, but if that's happening to you and you don't like it, let your painting dry, maybe take a break, get up and walk around, and then come back to it, and it won't do that to you again. So I'm going to take my brush, my round brush. I'm going to use my light yellow for the highlights. This is basically kind of like the reflection of the light behind the crosses. And I'm just going to put on a few little tiny details on the edges of the cross, not in the middle, because this is a silhouette, so that means they're being backlit. So the light source is right back here, so that means the edges would probably receive a little bit of a highlight, and the bottom parts of the cross would receive the most highlight. So the bottom edge, down low, close to the horizon. If you feel like the highlights don't look right and you're not happy with them, well, guess what? No stress. Paint covers paint. Paint it back to black. Okay, once you're happy with your highlights, you can swirl, tap, and dry your brush, and we're ready to move on to the very last step. This last step is optional. You by no means have to do it, but if you would like to make this ground a little bit more interesting, what you're going to do is use some of your previous colors, and you get to choose, to add some detail to the ground. I'm using my biggest brush, and I'm going to start with my kind of darker pinks and use those towards the bottom. Now, it might look a little weird when I put it on to get started. Like it might look a little too bright, like there's too much contrast and you might not like it, but keep in mind that this is going to dry darker. Also, if your black paint is still wet like mine is, then you probably will have some blending going on where you're making kind of a gray instead of a straight black. So I'm going to use these darker pinks on the bottom, and just like with the clouds, think of kind of swirling it, swiping it, maybe tapping it, just to get some texture on this ground. So it's not flat black, but it has a little bit more dimension to it. And again, this is an optional step. So if you're like, woof, I'm painted out, I'm done, that's cool. You can call yourself done and sign your name and call it quits. Now, as I move up towards the horizon line, I'm going to start using more of these light pinks. And again, you might look at that and be like, whew, that's way too light. Well, remember, paint covers paint. If you hate it, you can cover it back up with just straight black, so no stress. Also, it kind of dulls itself down the more you work the paint, and the more it dries, the darker it gets. So I'm going to just add a little bit more of my light color kind of towards the top of the horizon. And then I'm going to put in some shadows for our crosses. I'm just going to stick to maybe diagonal lines for the crosses. I'm not going to put a horizontal line on there just because I don't want to have a lot of detail. It's not a very detailed shadow. It's just the hint of one. But in order to do shadows, you have to lighten up the ground first a little bit. Okay, so I have done that to my ground, and now I can clean off my very dirty brush and put in my shadows. And to do the shadows, you're just going back to your black. Of course, you could paint in around the shadows, but that's kind of a little bit more of a tricky thing to do. I'd rather just put a layer of paint down and then put a layer of paint down on top of that. Paint covers paint. So I'm putting a diagonal line for my crosses, just because I don't want them to be straight down. I want them to kind of be on a diagonal so it looks a little bit more interesting and like a normal, natural shadow. And there we go. I have my shadows. I have a more interesting, dynamic ground. And remember, you can always go in there and add even more touches. For instance, if you really feel like that horizon line should be a little bit lighter and brighter, that's totally fine. This is your painting. Go ahead and add more details to your clouds if you'd like. You can go back in with some of your lighter pinks and maybe put on some highlights, okay, if you feel like your clouds need it. If you like your clouds, know when to quit and say, nah, it's good. Okay, I hope you enjoyed painting today, and as always, I encourage you to share your painting on Garden City Arts Facebook page. Tag us at Garden City Arts in your post, and we'll be able to see and share what you created. We hope you had fun, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.